Okay, let's talk about Andrew Jackson. The seventh president of the United States. He was a war hero, a so-called man of the people, and, well, he's also one of the most controversial leaders in American history. So what was he? A champion of democracy? Or a tyrant who basically acted like a king? Let's dig into the really complicated legacy of the guy on our $20 bill.
To really get a handle on Jackson, you've got to start with his personality. His supporters had this nickname for him, Old Hickory. Why? Because they saw him as being as tough and unyielding as a hickory tree. And honestly, it's the perfect description for his fiery, no-nonsense attitude about, well, pretty much everything, whether he was on the battlefield or sitting in the White House.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at his rise, from the frontier to a national hero. Then we're going to see why so many people called him the people's champion. After that, we'll get into his really controversial use of presidential power, face the darkest chapter of his presidency, and finally, try to make sense of what we call the Jackson paradox.
So let's dive into part one, the rise of Old Hickory. Our story really kicks off on the American frontier. See, unlike every single president who came before him, Andrew Jackson was not born into that wealthy East Coast elite. And this whole outsider thing, it's going to become a huge part of his identity and, you guessed it, his political power.
So long before he even thought about the presidency, Jackson was already a massive celebrity. I mean, think about this resume. He fought in the Revolutionary War as a teenager. Then he becomes a successful lawyer and U.S. senator. And then he seals the deal and becomes an absolute legend during the War of 1812, especially with that incredible victory at the Battle of New Orleans. The guy was a national hero. But his first shot at the presidency in 1824, well, it didn't go so well. It actually ended in a really controversial defeat. Get this, he won the popular vote, but the House of Representatives picked John Quincy Adams instead. Jackson and his supporters were absolutely furious. They called it the corrupt bargain. And that feeling of being cheated, it lit a fire under them, sparking this huge political movement that swept him into the White House with a landslide victory just 4 years later in 1828. And that landslide victory brings us right into the second part of our story, Jackson, the people's champion, and what really felt like a whole new era of democracy in America.
So what was at the very heart of Jackson's appeal? Well, it was this massive conflict, the common man versus the wealthy elite. He positioned himself as the champion for ordinary folks, farmers and workers who were fighting against the rich and powerful. His message was super simple, and it resonated. He said that wealthy bankers and politicians had been running the show for way too long. And let me tell you, the people absolutely ate it up.
And the thing is, he actually delivered on his promises. His administration massively expanded voting rights for white men by tossing out the old rule that you had to own property to vote. He also famously went to war with the Second Bank of the United States, which he saw as just a tool for the rich. And then, in 1835, he did something that no other president has ever done, before or since. He paid off the entire national debt. Seriously.
Okay, but how he got all this stuff done, that's where the story starts to get really complicated. And it brings us to part 3, his use of presidential power. So was he just a strong executive, or was he acting more like a king?
Just one number kind of tells you everything you need to know. 12. That's how many times Andrew Jackson used the presidential veto. Now, to put that into perspective for you, that is more than all 6 presidents who came before him combined. He totally changed the game, basically arguing that it was the president's job to protect the people from Congress.
He also brought in something that became known as the spoil system. Basically, this was the practice of giving government jobs to his political supporters as a reward. Now, he argued this was a good thing, that it made government more democratic by rotating people in and out. But his critics, they saw it very differently. To them, it was just a recipe for corruption.
And his belief in a powerful federal government really got put to the test during something called the nullification crisis. Here's what happened. South Carolina basically declared a federal tax law null and void within its borders. Jackson was not having it. He was furious and threatened to send federal troops down there to enforce the law. He made it crystal clear that, for him, preserving the Union was the #1 priority, no matter what. A compromise was eventually worked out, but wow, it was a scary preview of the conflicts to come.
But here's the thing. Jackson's vision of the common man, it didn't include everybody. And this brings us to the truly undeniable, tragic, and dark chapter of his presidency. This is his legacy of tears.
In 1830, President Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act,
and he enforced it aggressively. This policy gave the federal government the power to forcibly kick Native American tribes out of their ancestral homelands in the Southeast and move them to territory west of the Mississippi River.
The result was nothing short of a human catastrophe. These forced marches of the Choctaw, the Cherokee, and other tribes, they became known as the Trail of Tears. We're talking about thousands of men, women, and children dying from disease, from starvation, from exposure. It is, without a doubt, the darkest stain on Andrew Jackson's entire legacy. And, this is really where that critique of him being King Andrew hits the hardest. Because to enforce this policy, Jackson straight up ignored a Supreme Court ruling that had actually sided with the Cherokee Nation. Just think about that. It was an absolutely stunning use of presidential power, putting his own will above the highest court in the entire country.
So, that brings us to our final section, what's known as the Jackson Paradox. How on earth do you weigh a legacy that has both the champion of the common people and the architect of so much suffering?
Let's just lay it all out there on a final scorecard. On the one hand, yeah, he increased participation in democracy, he represented the common man, he made the presidency more powerful, and he paid off the national debt. But on the other hand, you have the absolute horror of the Indian Removal Act, the corruption that came from the spoils system, and the economic damage caused by his war on the bank. With Jackson, you can't have one side without the other.
And that really explains why, even today, how he's remembered is split pretty much 50-50 right down the middle. For every person out there who admires him as this great, transformative president, there's someone else who sees him as a ruthless leader with devastating policies. He is still, to this day, one of the most hotly debated figures in all of American history. So, we're left with the big question. Was he a savior of the people or a ruthless tyrant? The story of Andrew Jackson's presidency doesn't really give us any easy answers. Instead, it leaves us with a really tough but really important question we all have to think about. How do we judge leaders from the past when their legacies are just filled with these deep and often painful contradictions?